somebody else can always come in and improve the look and feel without messing it up. So I've always separated the concerns in such a way that it's easy to extend and to make pretty without breaking the stuff. And I try to get a clean line between, okay, this is the appearance and this is the business logic or the interaction logic. And in fact, I made very sure that business decisions is not in the front end, so that there's fewer things you can mistakes you can make. In fact, even today now, when I design an API, I still think about what does the front end person need to do and build, and so that they literally know I need to present this. I can do these things. That's why I like using Spring Hatios, because that gives you a way to give them a resource with a set of links. And if the link is absent, then the resource is not available. So then it's an easy for them to turn buttons on and off based on what's in the resource, and they can build the UI based on that. And then the other golden rule is validate everything at the back, regardless of who claims to validate what on the front end. But then publish tools or publish the rules or what such that they can also do it on the front end, because that then might alleviates frustration, because the user doesn't want to fill in stuff and submit and then get a weird message back that was supposed to not even happen because the front end did its job. And but it's, I mean, some things have not changed that much, and other things have changed radically. I think they've gotten much more complex. Or yes, I would use the word complex, because complicated, well, both applies, because complicated means there's lots of things involved, but you can still get it done, and it might just take longer. Complex means it's less predictable, and I think we've got both, especially on the front end. So I just want to see if we've got people that's starting to join. It's involved, but you can still get it done. And let me just mute this, otherwise I've got an echo that doesn't get cancelled. Okay, we've got some people online already. I'm just gonna type a message here. Please join this Slack channel to ask questions. There we go. Okay. There's something I must shut up because it's making noises that we don't need. Do not disturb. Okay. So I think before we start, maybe what you can do so long is tell me a bit about yourself. How did you land up where you now? Where were you before? What was your journey through to discover this weird industry we're in?
Where should I start? So I joined JetBrains in July of this year. So I'm rounding up my third month as a developer advocate at JetBrains. And before that, I was at bol.com, which is an online retail platform in the Netherlands and Belgium. And I was there for 5.5 years, mostly working on microservices. I was in 3 different teams over that period of time. The first one did have a bit of front end, but that's really not my strength or interest. So we had some other people on the team who did that. And the rest was mainly back-end services. So REST services, some GraphQL. using Java and Kotlin and occasionally Scala, but I don't really know a lot about Scala, and I prefer Java and Kotlin. I've been in IT for 20 years, I think, and I studied social science informatics, which is a mix of computer science and social science. So really looking at the interaction of human and computers, one-on-one usability, to what helps IT become successful in organizations, to what is the impact of IT in society as a whole. And so I've always or usually had roles that were sort of that mix on the border of what should it do and how does it do that.
And now you're focusing on a new subset of society, which is the developers.
The developers, yes. And hopefully making their lives easier or helping making their lives easier.
Now for me, that's always been a very important thing in the teams that I worked, because I always felt that it's literally the best effort you can spend is if you can do something that takes 10 or 20 people and improve their lives. It's great, and if you actually get the feedback, it's even better. And if you can measure it, it's even better, because everybody benefits, and you can see it. Now, I imagine where you are, a big chunk of what you need to do is to figure out, how do I measure the impact of what I do? Because I've seen some interesting conversations from DevRel people is, how do we do that? And where I'm now, because I joined VMware in March, and I'm now also have to think about this community, because I'm now part of the Spring team, but I'm on Spring Cloud Data Flow, and it's one of the elements in Spring that's not just a library, it's actually a product. So we ship programs and containers and stuff that you can run to build an application that manipulates data using a set of pre-configured applications. So finding out what the user's about and what they're doing is actually quite a challenge, especially if they're in the open source community. You'll only hear if they have a problem.
And why isn't it fixed yet?
Oh, yes. Now we do actually have some users are actually commercial users. They buy a license and essentially support. And so from them, we hear quickly, but they're a subset. So I was lucky to discover somebody that actually started with the OSS version, and then by accident discovered that the organization had actually bought a whole big VMware suite of licenses that included this stuff. So that's how we came to know about them. And their questions weren't about how do we build it, because they were in production. They were about how do we do this kind of runtime deployment, and of course it was new. So there's a new problem to solve. So I'm actually hoping to spend some time with them, discovering their journey, and actually write about it and invite them to talk about it, so that we can share the journey, warts and all. But I think our users are online, so I'm not going to spend any more time. I am going to hand over to you. So I'm going to welcome our users. Thank you for joining us. Once again, a reminder, if you want to ask questions, you are welcome to post it on the Slack channel. And if they are urgent, I'll relay them to Marit. Otherwise, she will probably get to all the questions at the end of her talk. And if you've just joined, you'll see there is actually a dedicated channel for the meetup. It's got the meetup date at the start and everything. And the link of the channel is also shared in our meetup. So I invite you to join us there. And without wasting any more of Marit's time away from her family, I'm going to hand over to her and to tell us about keeping up with your dependencies.
Okay. Yeah, so today I'm going to talk about keeping your dependencies in check. Normally, if this was an in-person meetup, this is where I'd be asking you, do you use open source software? But I can't see your show of hands. So last week I did the same talk in Rotterdam, and there was a group of about 20 people and all of their hands went up. So I'm just going to assume that most of you, if not all of you, also use open source software at work and maybe in your side projects. Open source is everywhere, and it can be really useful because it can provide functionality for you without you having to write it yourself. Excuse me. And that means that you can deliver business value faster. But of course, there are downsides as well. One of the downsides is that if you declare a dependency, that might pull in a bunch of transitive dependencies. And if multiple of your declared dependencies pull in transitive dependencies, those dependencies might clash. And you'll have to resolve those collisions. Also, all of those dependencies combined make your binary larger, and that might slow down your startup times. But the final downside that we're going to mainly focus on today is there might be vulnerabilities in any one of your either declared or transitive dependencies. So I asked last week in Rotterdam, what happened in December 2021? And a couple of people started giggling or laughing or groaning more like. So I know that they remembered. Last year, a vulnerability was found in the logging framework Log4j, and it was so severe that we had to patch all of our applications as soon as possible. And in our case, twice, because after the first vulnerability was fixed, they found several others that also needed to be fixed, so we had to apply more patches a second time around. And then in March of this year, we got to do all of that again because of a vulnerability in Spring called Spring for Shell. That time it was faster because we had just gotten the practicing in December. So as we can see, there is a balance to strike between upsides and downsides of using open source dependencies. There are two ways to deal with that. On the one hand, there are people who prefer to have as little dependencies as possible. The upside is there are less vulnerabilities, less clashes to resolve, and you have more control over what the code does because you're not depending on some framework and how they implement something. But it's more work and you'll have to do everything yourself, and some things maybe you shouldn't do yourself, mainly cryptography. On the other hand, there are people who are like, let's use all the dependencies, it can't hurt. If there's something to make my life easier, let's just pull it in. But of course, the downside is you have to maintain all of that with their clashes and vulnerabilities or any other downsides. So in general, we need to think clearly about and carefully about, do we need this dependency? Preferably before we pull it in, but it can't hurt to periodically reevaluate the dependencies that you have. What are some of the things that we should think about when selecting dependencies? The first one is fit. does this dependency solve the problem that we have without introducing new problems? So does it do the thing that we want it to do? Does that match? Is this dependency the best solution, or are there others out there that might be a better fit? Is our problem really small and the library we want to use for it really big and offers a ton of functionality and we're only using a small part? Are the upsides and the downsides in balance? For example, I've seen string utils used as a dependency. It's a relatively small dependency, but even then, I've seen it used for 1 or maybe 3 methods in a microservice, and especially when we're then moving them to Kotlin, we can use Kotlin standard library functionality and remove string utils. Another one is using Jackson versus JSON. They basically do the same thing, if slightly differently. So if you already have one, you don't need to import the other. Other things to consider if you're using Lombok or Reactor, they have a lot of impact on your code base. So they might be, if you ever want to remove them in the future, that would be really hard. So all of these are things to consider. The next thing to consider is how well is this dependency maintained? And that means the frequency of commits, the number of releases and how frequent they are, but also the number of active maintainers and committers. And there's an XKCD for everything. You don't want to depend on a project that's maintained by one person. Maintainer burnout is real, like we were just discussing with Cornel at the start. If you're working on an open source project, people will be like, why isn't this fixed yet? You don't hear from them unless something is wrong. And that's really hard if you're the only person maintaining something and you get a lot of negativity. The other thing is, what if this person, for whatever reason, is no longer able to maintain this project? This is often called the bus factor, which is like, what if this person gets hit by a bus? But I don't really like that term. I have heard the term lottery factor. What if this person wins the lottery and doesn't have to write code unless they really, really want to? And they stop maintaining this dependency. The next thing to consider is it a popular project? If it's popular, there will be a larger community of users. There will be more people who are writing or talking about it, and a lot more people that can potentially help you and may become committers to the project, although the funnel from user to committer is not always enough, or most often not enough. And another thing to consider is this community welcoming and is it helpful? Or do they just let you figure out everything on your own? The next thing is it easy to implement? Is it easy to use? Is the documentation any good? Is there documentation? It's often overlooked. Also not something a lot of people want to do or can do is write documentation. But if possible, I always prefer to use the official documentation because not only will it hopefully explain how to install it and how to use it, but also how it's intended to be used, which might not be the case if you're reading blog posts by people who just started using it. And of course, you have to like using it, preferably, especially if you have other options. Pick the one that you like. There are so many testing frameworks, for example. Pick the one that you like to use. And finally, if you've decided that you do want to use the dependency, make sure to use the latest stable version and make sure that there aren't any known vulnerabilities in that version. Where do we look for this information? One place to look is Maven repository. We can see here that it lists the versions. It also lists for several older versions that there are vulnerabilities. It lists the usages, so other artifacts that use this dependency and the release dates of those versions. And if we go into one of the older versions with the vulnerability, we see that there's an alert saying there is a newer version for this artifact, and also that there is, a vulnerability, and the CVE number is a link to the MITRE database with information about that dependency. Now I'm using Jackson Databind not to diss Jackson, because we've used that a lot in my previous job. It's just that Jackson is an example where I know that they've had vulnerabilities in the past and they might have them again. And it's the first one where I got an alert that I was using a dependency that had a vulnerability. We'll get into alerts in a little bit. So another place where we can look for information is on GitHub, if that's where the code is. The code might be in a different place, but a lot of projects are on GitHub nowadays. So on GitHub, we can see, I don't know if you can see my mouse, so we can see the number of commits, when the last commit was done. This screenshot is by now a week old. So it might be last week by now, and it might still be yesterday or today. We can see the number of watches, the number of forks, the number of stars. Let's say something about how popular the project is. And if we want to have more details, we can go to Insights and see, for example, who the committers are, how frequently they commit, etc. Another place to look for dependency information is a package search website by JetBrains. This combines some of the information that you can also find on Maven repository and GitHub. And package search is also integrated in IntelliJ IDEA as of version 2021.2, which means that you can also use package search directly in your IDE. And the information that you can find is the versions, how to import it. In this example, often there's a link to the website of the project. In this case, that's a GitHub page, a link to the source code, in this case, also on GitHub. There's a README tab for this project. That isn't always the case. And the versions tab will show you again the list of versions like we saw on Maven repository. So most likely you will end up with a few or a lot of dependencies in your projects, and you'll have to keep them up to date and also periodically decide whether you still want to use these dependencies. But keeping them up to date can take a lot of effort, and the business value isn't always clear unless there's a known vulnerability and we have to update right now. Keeping them up to date is not as fun as writing code. So how can we make this manageable? Maven has several commands that can help us with this. We can use Maven dependency tree to get an overview of the dependencies that your project is using. So it will list all of your direct dependencies and then the transitive dependencies that pulls in, so that you know what you're using and which versions. And we can use Maven to check for dependency updates. So if you use Maven's version display dependency updates, it will give you a list of these are the dependencies that have a newer version. This is the version you're using, and this is the version that you can update to. And you can even analyze your dependencies and see if there are any unused dependencies that you can remove. By the way, I'm using an example project here that's really, really old. It was built from a tutorial in 2017 and it wasn't updated. So the project itself is not a good example, but it is a great example of showing you a project that's really outdated. Of course, if I had unused declared JUnit, I wouldn't remove JUnit, I would consider adding tests, but that's a different talk. Gradle also has a command to get the dependency tree. It's even an easier command, dependencies. I'm not very familiar with Gradle. I've used mostly Maven, but I do want to show you some options. In order to check for dependency updates in Gradle, you need to add a plugin. The most common one I found is the Ben Mains plugin, which you add to your plugin section. And then you can use the dependency updates command to check for updates that your project needs. In this example, I'm using the Spring Pet Clinic project because it has a Gradle wrapper, and I can use the Gradle commands there. I wasn't able to find a native Gradle command to analyze dependencies like we just saw for Maven. Best I could find was that there are several plugins that can do that for you. But not being familiar, I can't recommend which one to use. Excuse me. And what I recently found in IntelliJ IDEA is that we have the integration with package search, but also this is an example from the community edition. You can see the little squigglies under the version. It will tell you if you do Alt-Enter, it will give you a suggestion on how to fix that. And it will tell you that you can update JUnit to version 4.13.2. Of course, there's also JUnit 5, but because that's a different dependency, you'd have to do that manually. And also you'll need to make code changes to update from JUnit 4 to JUnit 5. This also works in Gradle. This example again from the Spring Pet Clinic. And in the Ultimate Edition, it's even better. This is my favorite new feature, to be honest. It will highlight in yellow, this dependency has vulnerabilities, and it will list the information about the vulnerabilities and with links to information about those vulnerabilities. And this is a collaboration with Checkmarks, which is a security company that provides this information about the vulnerabilities. The downsides of all of the things that I've just shown you, I mean, they can help you keep your projects up to date. But if you have multiple microservices, like I did at my past job, you'd have to check out each project, check the manifest file, or run the commands to look for updates, and then apply and verify all of those updates. So that can be a lot of work depending on how many projects you have. Software composition analysis can help you to scan all of your repositories and create an overview for you. At my previous employer, we had an internal tool on top of the tool that was used for scanning, which would list for all of the teams their applications, a score on how well they scored in terms of security and dependencies. And then you could drill down on each application and see how many vulnerabilities were found and what their severity was. So you knew what to fix without having to check out all of your individual repositories. Software composition analysis is different from static application security testing, which will also check your code for known bugs, etc. But we're focusing mainly on keeping your dependencies up to date and not other tools that can help you fix bugs or find bugs. So the upsides is that we don't have to check out all of our individual repositories, but the downside is we do have to go check the dashboard, see if there are vulnerabilities that were found in our applications, and then go and fix them. So one way to make that even easier is to use bots. For Java, there are 3 options. There's Dependabot, Renovate, and Sneak Open Source. And all of these can scan your repositories and create automatic PRs to tell you to update certain dependencies. So let's take a look at each one. Dependabot is GitHub native. So they acquired Dependabot in 2019, and it includes 3 components. Dependabot alerts, which will just inform you that you have an outdated dependency, but it won't create the PR. Dependabot security updates, which will tell you, which will create a PR if there is an update because of a security vulnerability. And Dependabot version updates, which will just create PRs for newer versions, even if there isn't a security vulnerability. On GitHub, it's really easy to enable. You can do so via your profile. You go to settings and then security, and you can enable each of these components. Dependable alerts, this is what that would look like. So there will be a banner on your project saying there are vulnerabilities found, and if you click the button to see the alerts, it will give you a list of the alerts or the outdated versions that were found. The security updates will look like this. It will provide some information, and you can use commands like you see in the bottom here, dependable rebase, or close, ignore, merge, reopen. You can use a set of commands to interact with these PRs. To use dependable version updates, you need a little bit of configuration. You need to add a dependable YAML file to your project. And this does have some interaction with the configuration of the security updates. You have to tell it where which package manager you're using and where to find the manifest file. You can set the frequency, the schedule, the maximum default, the default maximum number of PRs is 5, but you can adjust that. And there are a few other details that you can set to manage the PRs. So who to assign it to, reviewers, preference for commit messages or labels that you want to add, and a rebase strategy, whether you want to automatically rebase or not, which branch to PR to, some things like that. So the next option is Renovate. Renovate is also available on GitHub via the GitHub app, which makes it fairly easy to install on a GitHub repo. It's also available for several other systems, but it will be more work. And I'm looking mainly here at the functionality offered by each bot and not all of the combinations of build servers, etc., that we could use them with. So to enable Renovate via the GitHub bot or GitHub app, you go to this page. I will share the slides at the end, the location of where you can find the slides. So you click Configure on this page. You can choose whether to apply it to all of your repositories or only selected repositories, which makes this the easiest option if you just want to try it on one repository. The other two don't offer this option. Renovate will then create a configuration PR, which adds a configuration file or a basic configuration file. And once you merge that PR, it will start running the scans. So the configuration options for Renovate are all your repositories or some of the selected repositories. The config file is created for you. You can limit concurrent branches in PRs, and you can set an hourly limit. So there are more options to configure, and those options are more fine-grained. So it has all of the things that Dependable has, but more and more detail. One thing also I liked is they have a configure option or config option for stability days. So the number of days that is required before a new release is considered stable. A Renovate PR will look like this. So here they also provide information about the age of the package, the adoption, which is the percentage of this package users with Renovate that are using this release, passing, the percentage of updates which have passing tests for this package, and confidence, the level of confidence for this update. So in this case, for one of them that is high, they suggest you update. And neutral means either they don't have enough information or they can't determine what the level of confidence is based on the information that they have. Also, Renovate will add a dashboard to your repository that shows a list of all of the updates that you can do that are open so that you have an overview. So the last option is Sneak. Sneak is a security company that offers lots of products that can help you make your code more secure. One of them is Sneak Open Source, which is free to use on your repositories. So to enable Sneak, you have to go to their website and start free. So you click the blue button here. So here. And then you have to authorize Sneak login. I did so with GitHub. You can also do it with Google. So you authorize Sneak. It will give you the option between applying Sneak to public and private repos or public repos only. And it will give you several options. One is to test for vulnerabilities when you create a pull request. That's an option the other two don't have. So if you create a pull request to your repository and add a dependency, Sneak will, as a part of that PR, check that you're not adding a vulnerable dependency, where the other two only will find out when their scan is scheduled. So that's a big bonus of using Sneak. They can create pull requests to fix vulnerabilities, just like the other two. They can create pull requests to upgrade out-of-date dependencies, so like the Dependabot version updates. And they can test for vulnerabilities in the source code, so that's more of a static scan. So the last thing to enable Sneak is you have to enter an access token for the account to use. A Sneak PR will look like this. So they also provide information about the severity, the vulnerability that was found with a link to more information and what the suggested upgrade is. Another thing they do is if there are vulnerabilities that can be grouped, they will create one PR where they group those instead of 5 separate PRs in this example. And that makes it so that there is less noise, so less PRs to deal with. All of these can be combined into one PR. And that's also something the other ones don't have. So the Sneak PR check, this is what that would look like on a random PR. Sneak also provides a dashboard with an overview of your repositories, the number of vulnerabilities that were found, etc. And this is what that looks like for projects. Lots and lots of old unmanaged projects in my repository or in my GitHub profile. So for the Sneak open source configuration, you can also set the frequency to daily, weekly, or never. I don't know why you would set it to never, then just don't have it. But you can enable and disable to check for either new and or known vulnerabilities. So the known vulnerabilities would be to clear your backlog of any outdated dependencies. And you can enable and disable PRs for individual projects. So overall, the updates are for all of these bots are relatively easy to install. They can create automatic PRs, and the ones that we've discussed are free, at least on a personal level. I do have to say that with the exception of Dependabots, you might get sales emails or contacts from the other companies. So, free with a bit of a challenge or a caveat. And of course, they will generate automatic PRs, but you will still have to manage them. You will have to decide when do we want to merge them, when do we want to deploy them. Just because the build passes doesn't mean that we can safely deploy this and everything will be okay in production. We might want to at least do a smoke test or watch this deployed version for a little bit, check the logs, make sure that everything still works, make sure that nothing is erroring, or at least not more than usual. And of course, none of them make any changes to our code if those are needed with a version update, for example, like from JUnit 4 to 5. So this is the same slide, but with a different image. Anyway, so there are some tools that can help you make changes to your code. One is error-prone. Error-prone is a static analysis tool for Java, which will catch common programming mistakes. So it's not specifically intended to migrate your dependencies. It's originally intended to catch common mistakes and be able to automatically fix them, but you can also use it for migrations. It supports Maven, Gradle, and a few others, Bazel and command line, and there are a few plugins. They have a lot of bug patterns for the common mistakes, like they say, that you can find on this website. They have the option to either report those bugs or to automatically fix them. And they have the option to create custom checks. And one of the ways is Refaster, which used to be a separate project but was integrated into Errorprone. It allows you to refactor code using before and after templates. Sander Mak did a great talk on this, both at JSpring of this year and JFall of last year. Those are the two conferences of the NL-Jug, so the Dutch Java user group. And you can find this talk on YouTube if you want to know more about how to use Errorprone and how they used it at Picnic. And they used it, for example, to upgrade Java versions. And another tool that looks really promising is Open Rewrite. Open Rewrite is a source code refactoring for framework migrations, vulnerability patches, and API migrations. And it focuses on Java at the moment. It also supports Maven and Gradle. And they have a lot of existing recipes. Sorry, by a lot, I mean the 10, 12 around there. That I found on their website, but it includes, for example, an update from Java 8 to 11, from JUnit 4 to 5, so several well-known migrations that they can support for you. And like Errorprone, they have the option to author your own recipes. So that could be really useful if you have to migrate multiple repositories or the same thing multiple times in one repository. I haven't tried either of these tools personally, but Sander has a really great talk on their experience with Errorprone, and I'm hoping to try out Open Rewrite somewhere in the near future. So to summarize, think about which dependencies you want to use, not only when you start using them, but also periodically check, are these still the ones that we want? Are these projects still supported? Automate checks and updates if you can, and stay safe. And as promised, a link to the slides that I used in this presentation. Okay. It's so weird talking to my computer, though.
It is. It is. It can be challenging.
Yeah.
Because you feel so alone. And regardless, we haven't had any questions. I've actually got some. So I saw a few things I haven't seen before. Obviously, if you haven't seen Dependabot, then you haven't been on GitHub.
I think that Dependabot was the first time I got an alert. Yes. I think it's when they just acquired it or something. I got an alert on one of my repos. It's like, you're using an outdated Jackson version. I'm like, oh, we use that at work. Let me go check.
So it's it's definitely useful. And the reality is that I mean, I only heard the term software supply chain, I think, earlier in this year or late last year. And the reality is that it's actually critical, because it really talks about what are the things we use, and what can go wrong. If you're building physical things, you're buying your supply chain of physical things that you typically have an incoming QA department that will test a batch and draw a sample and measure things and say, okay, these bolts are the right size, or no, they're not according to the specification and the tolerances and that type of thing. With software, things can change under your feet. And we've all experienced that. And it's not necessarily pleasant. So
I did not enjoy updating all of our microservices
no, and releasing
twice
3
in a
times
row.
in a month, that was quite a rough exercise. And I mean, I worked on a project that was with an insurance company, and this project actually started its life in about 2002, 2001 as a Java project. And then they were targeting the technology at the time, which was basically they had chosen to go Corba instead of application server, and they just used plain Tomcat services. So it was light, but they had this whole collection of Corba services. So by the time I joined, the system had 300 modules with 4 or 5 web apps and about 50 Corba services still. So this was in about 2011, 2012. And then they also had about 40 or 50 EJB applications. So they had started creating new ones as EJBs, and they had started those Corba ones that they could move. They moved. Some stayed the way they were, but it was this whole big thing. And obviously, to make it worse, there was so many places where people referenced code that was only in the transitive dependencies.
Mm.
And I think that is one of the first things you need to fix. And there's no tool that really tells you, hey, you're importing code, but it's not in your direct dependencies, it's in the transitive dependency. So I'm planning to write, because I wrote code back then to do this analysis. And I'm going to package that code as a Maven and a Gradle plugin so that you can put it in your build so that it can tell you you're importing code, and that code comes from a jar that's not in your direct dependencies, because that's a potential hurdle you're going to fall over. It can go away and you won't know why, especially if you're now, because I mean, if we look at our audience.
Maven Analyze provides some of that information on
Yes.
unused, declared, used, undeclared, etc.
Yes.
So I
But
think
on
that
the
provides some
Gradle,
of the information, but yeah.
nothing. So what I'll do is I'll actually go and double check that on the Maven side to see if it does what I need. We actually on that project
and whether it's something that should be contributed directly into Maven.
Yes.
I think
Yes.
instead of having your own plugin that you write and that you may or may not maintain in the future.
Yes. So what we found then, we started, so this project was big. They were using a combination of Ant and Python and Groovy and Bash, and they could never get a stable build because the dependencies weren't consistent. So, and because it was so big, you couldn't build everything locally. You wanted to work with a subset, but it never retrieved everything that was changed from the repository. And I tried to first switch it to Maven.
If you're using Maven or Gradle, at least
Yes,
you'll hopefully have a reproducible build. Although I've also seen that with Maven you can specify ranges. So then
then you get some new surprises.
Yes.
But that's another thing where you can. So this, what I want to do with this tool is to warn people about potential problems, because that, for example, that range is not a bad thing while you're working on a snapshot, but if you're approaching release, you want to lock it down. You don't want to have a release build and you've got dependencies that you haven't explicitly decided.
Exactly.
And that's why I love the idea of a BOM. So, I mean, the Spring Boot, there's a BOM. And for those who don't know, it comes from the short for bill of materials, but it's basically a collection of dependencies that essentially identify all the dependencies and versions that go together. So somebody has done a lot of testing to make sure these things work together so that you don't have to. So
Exactly.
if
So
you
that
now
you
go
know
and
that these are the versions of transitive dependencies that you're
says,
using, etc.
and so what that means is you don't stop declaring dependencies, you just stop adding the versions. Um, the BOM brings the versions, but you must still declare your dependencies. You just trust the BOM to bring in the best version. And that's where a range might be useful, because you find that, oh, this thing is a problem, but I can't change the BOM now. So now I override it and I use a range, which means that if a new version of the BOM moves past me and I forget to update this, I'll get the new range, because the newer version, because it's higher than my range setting. So that's one area where it's not a bad idea, because you're basically saying this is the minimum, but let the BOM decide. But the bottom line is, and I think you said it more than once, is if you develop software and you want to take responsibility for the output, but you're ignoring the input, you are going to get woken up in the middle of the night to fix strange problems. People are going to ask you questions and give you CVE numbers and things like that. And your life's going to be interesting for a period of time, but
And
learn
I like
from
my
that.
life to be not interesting. I like my software development to be boring and predictable.
Yes, yes. I mean, we live in interesting times as it is.
Yeah, no, I'm
So,
done with that. Yeah. That was a
no,
Terry Pratchett reference, right?
yes, yes. So, I mean, the Chinese have this saying, and people
Yep.
didn't realize it was a curse. May you live in interesting times. But
Yes. And
now
I'm done with the interesting times.
realize,
I would like times to
no,
be less interesting now. Please and thank
exactly,
you.
exactly.
Yes.
We want to make our own choices, and we want to. So you can choose your dependencies, choose your projects, and because everything has an up and a downside.
Yeah.
I must say, from all the ecosystems I worked with, the Java ecosystem is, from my perspective, the most stable and long-lived. I've got code that's been in production since early 99. It's still running in production. In fact, that project hasn't been rebuilt since July 2002. It's still working. But we had zero dependencies, because in those days, no, we had some, but it was just one component, and it was depending on some early Java EE stuff, and those are still all the same. If they now move away from those, so if they want to move up and run against something later than Java 8, they're probably going to start getting a challenge. But it's not insurmountable. It'll probably be a quick refactor to fix. And I might get a phone from somebody.
So, and there are
For
tools
20
that can
years.
help you with those refactorings.
Yes. Oh, I
And
mean,
I really want to look into those more, because yeah, we started adding Renovate to our projects in the last
yes,
team I was in before joining JetBrains. And I really liked it because I no longer had to manually check or go to the dashboard to check. It would just
yes.
tell us, but it did generate a lot of noise. And then you run into, some people who are like, it builds, let's ship it. And other people are like, no, be more careful. Wait.
Let's
Um,
review at least.
so
But
you still,
I think it
as
depends
a
on the
team, you
quality
still
of your
have to,
testing.
yeah, how confident are you in your test suite? And some people are naturally more risk taking or risk averse. So you still in your team have to discuss, how do we want to handle these? Um,
Yes.
and we have had merges where the build was green, but for example, a failsafe update, which caused the integration tests to no longer be run. So yes, the build was green, but we're actually testing less now. So we reverted that. And I don't actually recall what the problem was. Maybe there was a property or a setting that changed and was no longer used or something. And the same for other dependencies. It depends on, I mean, there's a reason that the answer to any question is it depends. It's
Experience.
the interesting bit is, what does it depend on?
Yes.
So yeah, depending on how confident you are in your test suite, and of course the risk that you might have if something breaks, you may decide to go faster or slower with those updates. But at least you have an overview and you know, okay, this one still builds, this one doesn't. If it doesn't, then you know, okay, I have to go check my tests to see whether they are failing. I have to see whether it still compiles. Maybe they did breaking changes in the new version. So it means it will be more work. So at least you already know that. You have that information instead of finding out when you're doing it manually yourself.
No, I actually wrote a little script the other day that will uses a command line XSLT to scan the Surefire reports to tell me there's so many tests ran, because I wasn't sure, and I actually discovered some tests that were skipped. And so now it's a separate step afterwards that says,
Nice.
check this, and if the number isn't bigger than that, fail.
Yeah.
Because
I have another.
Yes.
Sorry. I have another talk about testing. And it has some examples of some interesting things that I found, tests that had been ignored for 2 years, or my favorite, the most creative one was just the add test was commented out 4 years ago. So that test hadn't run all that time. So those are some interesting things to go look for in your projects to see how many ignored you can find or how many commented out tests. And whether they still work, or maybe you should just delete them. So yeah.
Well, that's one of my favorite activities, is to delete code.
Yes, mine too.
It's sort of let it go.
Yes.
So as a junior, you have to first learn to overcome that possessiveness, because it's my code. I wrote it. Now, if somebody paid you to write it, it's their code. You're just contributing your effort. It's not your child. I know there's emotional attachment to this creation, but let go, because you will lower your stress levels and you will improve your quality of life by a huge amount. And then if you can someday delete it because it's not needed anymore, that's fine, because it happens. I'm glad if I build something and it can be replaced by something that a team of very smart people is building and working on every day, and I don't have to do this type of thing anymore because I was premature. So just replace it and continue, and that will happen every so often. And well, if you like that code, go put it in a museum, create a repository for that little piece, demonstrate it, talk about it, and but the company can live without it, and every company needs to have the most trustworthy software. And regardless of whether they say, no, this thing is only going to live for 2 years, guess what? It won't.
It's going to live a lot longer, in my experience.
Yes. So it's an ongoing thing. In fact, I think that's one of the problems, is those companies that existed before software started eating the world are still learning this reality. So even though they've adopted software and their business processes rely on software, they at some level they're in denial, and it's to their own detriment, because once you realize that this is a long-term game, and it's a longer-term game than anything you've ever seen. It is then you can start making better decisions because you realize that this thing has increasing value. It's not an asset that depreciates over a period and you write it off. It's something that can have continued benefit. And part of managing that benefit and that value is managing your the health and wellness of your dependencies. So thank you for showing us all these wonderful tools. Our audience has been incredibly quiet. I just want to see if there's been any.
Yeah, I was just opening the Slack, and someone in the general channel said, I remember how frustrating it was to update all the dependencies in a past project for which I was following online tutorials. I wish I knew about the tools you talked about today. Thank you.
Oh, that's lovely.
And what's the tool you find yourself using the most? So in my last team, that was Renovate, because that was the bot that we had. We were using GitLab in my previous company instead of GitHub. So to implement Renovate in GitLab is a bit more work than it is in GitHub, but someone had figured that out and set it up for us in the company and created well-documented steps on how to add it to all of your repositories. So that's what I did. And we use that to stay up to date, or at least to also to have an idea of the status of your project without having to go check out the dashboard that was also available. So a mix of those two tools for me. But I am really excited.
It's like having this accountant with a clipboard walking around asking questions, but it's not a human. It's a system, and it's relentless. But you can ignore it if you want to, and it's the same. I mean, if you look at IntelliJ, I can't imagine working without it because it's like having somebody else pair program because they're making suggestions all the time, and they're usually very good suggestions. And especially if you're moving into Kotlin and you're new to it.
Yeah.
And man, it's incredible because I can literally hear Roman Elisarov or one of those talking in my ear because I can see that those things that I saw when I was watching the first videos and learning a bit, and then all those suggestions come through, and eventually, obviously, you do some of those things yourself. But the tools available are incredible, and you guys should use them. So
that's why also I was really excited about the package search and the package checker in IntelliJ, because then you can just see. I recently started at JetBrains. I've been a very enthusiastic IntelliJ IDEA user for the 5.5 years prior to that. So I wanted to create some demo code. So like the person who asked the question, I was using some tutorials like, okay, let me slap some stuff together. And it started yelling at me like, this stuff is outdated. Because of course, if you find an older blog post, that version will be outdated. Exactly. And I'm like, oh, what is this? This is really cool. It's now telling me as I'm importing it, don't use this one. It's not stable. It's vulnerable. Yes. So honestly, that's one of my
I wish IBM used it. I don't know if you've seen the insides of WebSphere. They have some dependencies there. That's a private snapshot of some of the Apache Commons libraries, and then, in fact, it doesn't even match any of the documentation. So now you have to fight to make it invisible to your program. So yes,
interesting challenges every day. Yes. Makes our life more boring.
Oh yes.
Yeah,
So,
so as far as tools, like of the tools specifically to update dependencies that I've talked about, that for me, that would be Renovate that I've used the most. Of course, of all of the tools that I've shown, I use IntelliJ almost literally every day. I use Maven a lot, and I'm more familiar with some of the Maven commands than I am with Gradle. But I want to also learn how to do the same stuff in Gradle.
now Gradle has some interesting things. One of the big things that I do appreciate of Maven over Gradle is because Maven is a XML file that conforms to a schema. I can write a very simple tool to analyze the information without running Maven. I can just look at the POM. Whereas with Gradle, if I want to know something, the best way is to run it and to have something that can get to all that information and use it. So one of the things I'm planning with this thing I was talking about is to actually have something that as part of the build, all it does is it just dumps essentially what you would have put in a POM into a file that can now be analyzed offline. So then you can have a bot that scans your a repo, or it's not, it doesn't have to be in your build, especially it depends on how long it takes. Because there's no convention for how we declare versions, because everybody has got their own place of where they put them. So there's no versions.properties where you can go and find all the versions or whatever. So it's always that challenge.
Yes, so in the teams I was in, we would put the versions in the parent POM
Yes.
in the properties,
Yes.
just to make sure that it was consistent across the modules, and so we had them in one place.
Yeah.
But that's more of a team convention, I guess, than it's not enforced by the tool.
But it's easy to find, because
Yeah.
even if you find it, you know that thing can only come from a property. So even analyzing the property section is easy.
And you can click it in IntelliJ, at least if it says like
and it'll
version,
jump.
you can just click it and it will jump to either the one that you declared or whatever POM it's getting it from, if it's transitive. So yeah, that's also useful.
Because that can be a hunt by itself. If you don't have that tool, then you're searching with Google and you're finding a POM and you're looking at something and then you're searching another POM.
Yeah.
But all those tools are getting better and better at integrating this information.
And you know that Maven has the effective POM, right? Where you can get the
yes.
What is the combination of inheritance, etc.
What's everything? Yes.
Yeah. So, and all of these things are useful to know if you ever run into trouble where you have to figure out how to solve something where it doesn't just work. Which are both incredibly interesting and useful in terms of learning new things, and incredibly frustrating in terms of learning what doesn't work. So,
no, but it's part of that software archaeology tool set that we all need to develop, because you won't know what it means until you start a new job at a company that has been doing software for more than a few years, and then they do things differently and in so many ways, and then you need to, because you don't just want to go and rewrite stuff. It doesn't work that way. You want to tread carefully. And then you discover a whole new skill set.
So that's one of the things I liked about my previous job, is that I switched teams, and also other people, join the team and leave the team and bring their own context and their own background and knowledge, and new tips and tricks and interesting things like, oh, I didn't know you could do that. Let's do that. And so when I switched from the team I was on the longest to the last team I was on, I was like, hey, did you know we could do this? And then, just do that. Or, setting up some stuff that other people who had joined my previous team had set up for us. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. They don't have that here. Let's do that. And
Yes,
set
yes,
up little things to make our lives easier. And I love doing that.
yes. No, me too. And one of the interesting thing about Maven is Maven's biggest selling point is that it supports convention over configuration. So if you ever worked with Ant, you would know you had to set up where your source was. And if you were evil, you would choose a whole different path structure than anybody else did. Because in the early days, it was just the source and a bin and a lib. And yes, we put the charge in the lib. And if you were using Ivy, everybody thought you were crazy. But and then Maven comes along. Oh no, we've got conventions. And now a few years later, you realize, no, but there's so much more than just the conventions, because the ecosystem has grown enormously. And little things like, where do you put the versions numbers? Do you use a bomb or not? Because the moment you have a bomb, you have something else you depend on, because you're literally depending on that bomb and you're a force on that bomb. And if there's multiple projects that depend on the bomb, then the changes to the bomb has a life cycle of them by themselves. And so it can get complicated. But thank you so much for your time. It was lovely. And
Thanks for
I
having
hope
me.
we can get you down on this side of the world someday. We have an annual conference that a lot of us are involved in. It's been running since 2015, called ICO Java Africa. It's
I've heard
coming
of
up in
that.
middle October, and but most companies have shut down their budgets a bit on terms of traveling. So we invited lots of people, and people thought they were coming, and it turned out no, they couldn't. So I don't think we have many foreign travelers at this year's one, but we would love to have you join us down here. And but once again, thank you for your time, and
Thank you.
good luck with your new adventure.
Thank you.
And we will watch you on Twitter. Did you put your handle on the?
I put them on all of the slides. I did.
Okay.
But
Share your the link for your deck. I think maybe you should just share the link for your deck in our Slack channel for the presentation.
yes.
And then people can, if they want to get more info, because I first got experience with SNCC, because I think they started a bit before Dependabot, and then Dependabot came along, and obviously when GitHub acquired them, they supplanted SNCC on the GitHub side very quickly. But it is it's a very important space, and
yeah.
you can't be too safe. Literally, you cannot. It is it's important. Like Log4Shell has shown us,
Yeah.
you can be seriously exposed. So and at least it's not the Node ecosystem, which is really scary, because they've got so many small little libraries that seem to be at the whim of somebody, and
Yeah.
you can even pull the rug. Whereas with Maven, once it's published. You can't unpublish it. Most of
Yeah.
those,
So not like LeftPad, right? That's what you're
yes,
referring to. Yeah.
yes,
Yeah. So I mean, of course, there are lots of vulnerabilities in the whole open source model. For example, Log4j, one of my ex-coworkers from Bol.com is a Log4j maintainer. and they are not getting paid. And this vulnerability was disclosed, and they had to fix it ASAP. And everybody was complaining, how is this even possible? Why don't they fix this? How is it even possible that it's in there? And they were fixing it for free, very urgently,
Very quickly, yes.
making 22-hour days, barely sleeping to try to get this fix out, and people were still complaining about it.
Yes.
So yeah, as much as I did not like having to urgently update all of my services, I feel for those maintainers even more, because they're doing that for free.
Pressure
They
was
don't care.
huge. Yes.
And I
So talk to your boss and tell them, no, so it's not to Barrett, it's to our audience. Tell them they can go through that list. So do a Maven tree and the things that come up. Look at who maintains them. So, for example, I know that the faster XML JSON libraries are also an individual guy doing great work, and find out how you can contribute, because some of these people make it possible and easy to contribute, and it's going to be a fraction of your budget to make their lives easier, because it actually allows them to maybe get some real help in, or actually take unpaid leave and work on something if it needs to, because their day job might not welcome that. Whereas I know that most people who contribute to visible projects have employers that say it's fine if there's something urgent, deal with it, because that's probably how they found the person in the first place.
So I hear varying stories. Some friends who are allowed to do open source on work time, some who are not. Some companies who sponsor open source and some who do not. Money by itself is not the solution, because if there's money for an open source project but nobody to do the work, it still won't get fixed. Actually, I I was an active contributor to Cucumber JVM, and the Cucumber documentation. I have not been as active since the past few years, where the world got really interesting, gestures broadly at everything. But I have also done a talk on ways that you can contribute to open source. You can find that on our IntelliJ IDEA YouTube channel from the, let me find it, JetBrains Day for Java Technology, or JetBrains Technology Day for Java 2 years ago. So that's a talk on all of the different ways that you can contribute to open source by writing code, but also lots of ways that isn't writing code. And one of my favorite things of doing that talk is, like you say, getting feedback from people saying, oh, I did my first contribution, up to a coworker, or by now former coworker of mine, who sort of sidled up to me at a conference and said, yes, I've been meaning to tell you, I saw that talk 2 years ago and started contributing, and now I'm a maintainer to Katie Lind. Like,
oh, wonderful.
Oh, so
that's great.
That's really cool. And
yes.
I mean, I want to get back into it. But yeah, starting a new job takes a lot of energy, so I have to sort of find my rhythm and find a way to start doing that again.
Yes. No, it's definitely, there's lots of projects that are making an effort to be inviting.
Yeah.
And
so Cucumber actually have a new contributors ensemble every week, Wednesday at 6 UTC, I think. I'm not sure, but you can find it on their website. So they stream on Twitch and have like new contributors join and do stuff together.
Oh, that's wonderful.
So that's one of the ways
that's
that they're
trying
to get new people.
Yes.
it was the first project that I contributed to, and I just really lucked out in terms of friendly and welcoming and helpful people, because I've also heard different stories of people
Oh
doing the
yes, there
first
have
PR
been.
and getting less than pleasant responses, let's say. So, but yeah, I also talk about that in my open source tool.
Yes,
If that's
yes.
something people are
No, so
interested.
if you just go on GitHub and you look at issues and you take away the I think there is open, and you start browsing. I mean, do yourself a favor and just search for swear words, and then you'll see if these people are swearing at their contributors. Then it's a no go,
Exactly.
and dodge that bullet. Um,
Yeah.
uh, 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 if it's something
And
that
this
you
was sort of
like,
implied in my, is it a popular project and what is the community like? Yes.
yes. But there are ways of finding it out, which
Yeah.
doesn't cost much,
Yes.
and it is useful. It's unfortunate if it's something that your company has deeply depends on, and you're now trying to get some problem solved, and you
Yes.
now have to solve a problem in a reasonable period and contribute it back and follow the license. It can be challenging, but
Yeah.
it's very rewarding to do. I mean, it's not my day job, so I'm glad. But I have a project that I started a few years ago. That's a part of my journey to learn Kotlin, and I keep a hand on that. And uh, I had some opportunities recently to speak to people who were using it, and one was interested in using it, and it's great because um, um, you make friends along the way, and you learn things, and uh, if you can do that while you do your job, that's wonderful.
Yeah, so that's one of the things as well. Even if you can't contribute code, you can report issues or test them, or
Mm-hmm.
um,
Fixed
we
documentation.
fix documentation, fix dead links. But always, if you find an issue with an open source project, check whether that issue has been filed already, and if not, file it yourself, provide information. If it has been filed, maybe provide additional information if you can. And I have to say, I've so far found only repos that have been welcoming and pleasant about these things. I've also filed issues for, hey, you're using outdated dependencies. Would you like me to update them? Yes, we would. Okay, here's the PR. Things like that. Or just saying, hey, we are finding an issue with this latest release. This is what we're doing. Here's all the information, and getting a quick response, and then providing the information that they request, and just helping them help us, basically.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
No, that's I find that very rewarding, and um, one of the things that's key. It might take a bit of work, but you probably learn something. Is people will say, "Oh, build a reproducer." So what that means is the smallest project that can reproduce the problem. And guess what? You're probably going to find the problem is something that on your side elsewhere, because it goes away when you make this small little project, and then you realize, okay, it's bigger. But so it's a good way to debug a problem or to get to the bottom of it is to isolate it. If your project doesn't allow you to set up a test to isolate it, then you have to think about what's wrong with your architecture, because it should provide that. But sometimes with an old project, you don't have that. And then the best is to isolate what you think is the problem, and build a little test project around it. And then you might get to the bottom of it, or it just magically disappears. And
I've
Hope
also managed.
it doesn't disappear completely because you happen to comment out something that you didn't realize.
Mhm.
Because that happens as well. I had one case where I added a tag to a test for some case, or a conditional test tag, so that I could test it by itself, but that happened to exclude it from all the others. And guess what? I thought the problem was gone, and it wasn't. And
Mm.
so,
Yeah. I've also
and that's
managed
where
to
it's
not
useful to have somebody else that can look over your shoulder.
yeah, I've managed to not reproduce a problem where I had a problem with an open source library and I thought I knew what it was. So I'm like, oh, I can write a reproducer for it. And then my example did not reproduce the problem. So I learned it must be something else. So, I had a hypothesis, it was false. Okay, back to the
Exactly.
drawing board. So,
Yes.
um, yeah.
And that's our life. So we
But it's still
are
not wasted time because you learn what didn't work. So,
exactly,
some days
exactly.
it gets really hard though if you have a lot of those days in a row where you learn what didn't work. But
Mhm. Then you come home and your partner says, "What's that? A red mark on your forehead?" And no, it's my face palm. Yeah.
yes. Well, fortunately, my husband is also a software engineer. So
Oh, so he will
the
recognize
upside
it.
is that we get to talk about work a lot, and the downside is that we get to talk about work a lot.
Yes.
Um, so, yeah.
Uh, okay.
Anyway,
Thank you so much for your time. It
thank
was
you so much
lovely
for having
meeting
me.
you.
Yes.
And maybe our paths cross with this side of the world or that side of the world. You never know. I've submitted for Kotlin Conf. I'm hoping to see if I can get accepted there. And
CFP is still open until October
yes,
1st for anybody watching who would like to submit.
yes. Um, there's no better way than learning something is to prepare a talk on the topic. Um,
Exactly.
or to develop a course. I mean, this was now in 92, I left NetBank, developed a C++ course and presented that for 18 months until Microsoft launched their whole Microsoft Developer Network and all their training. And then my clientele just dried up. But that was a great ride and an interesting way to just really get to the all the edges of the language. And I mean, next time I felt like that about a language was when I discovered Kotlin. So, but by then, um, there was everybody at Kotlin and Venkat, and then there's no room for somebody else to come along with training that can compete. Not while Venkat is still alive. So
Well, I hope he'll be alive for a long time to come
oh
because
yes,
I
no, he
really
will
enjoy learning from him.
exactly. But I just realized after watching some of his videos that it's going to be a very long time until I have something to offer that will surpass him, because his ability to just get to the heart of a topic and explain is incredible. So no, the world has changed. It's the amount of information available is incredible.
Mm.
The amount of information that's available for free is incredible. It's made people unwilling to pay for stuff, which is problematic, because things don't just fall out of the sky.
Mm.
Somebody has to put in work to make something happen. Sometimes it's for the love of it. Sometimes they get paid. You don't necessarily know, and don't assume they got paid for it. Find out and see if you can help them if they didn't get paid.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, I think our audience are going to bed now, so I think we should do. I think your family is probably waiting for you.
Yes.
So thank you for your time, and
Thanks again.
say hi to Heidi if you speak to him.
Yes, will
And
do.
as I say, good luck with the rest of your journey. And thank you very much. It was
Thanks for having me.
great fun.